Anthony, your trailer for The Last Shift has millions of views combined.
Yes, yeah.
Why do you think it's so popular?
I think, when I sought out to make The Last Shift, I wanted to scare people. Like, that was my main. And I had done other, what you would call thrillers in the genre, but I think Last Shift was my first real horror film. And my intention was I just want people to watch this movie and be terrified. Right? That was my goal. So the plot was very simple. And I think over the years, it got just good word of mouth. People were like, this is actually a scary movie. It's like it became got a cult following. I think people are still revisiting it now. So it's kind of one of those films. When I grew up, you could go to the video store and rent a movie. You could tell your friends, like, hey, you've never seen this movie, you should watch this. You get excited when you get to share a movie with someone they haven't seen. Last Shift still has that. I think people can, even in today's day and age, you can still tell your friends, oh, you've never seen Last Shift, we should watch this together, you're gonna have a blast. And I think that's why it's continued to have legs.
And plus, I think you feel something for the protagonist right away when she's on the phone call. I don't want to give too much away,
Yeah.
but the opening shots, and you want to go on this ride for her, you want to root for her.
Yeah, and I think that, again, that was like so intentional of just like, let's throw people in right away. Because yes, the movie opens and you're just listening to this girl talk on the phone to her mother. You're kind of creeping up behind her, and you're immediately in her point of view. It's almost like you're playing a video game. She's the main character and you're just over her shoulder, right? And you're reacting with her the entire movie. I think that really puts, especially in that genre, in thriller and horror, it puts you in the seat, right? It really does when you're not ahead of the protagonist, you're not behind her, you're with her the whole time and you're learning. We're not telling you a lot about her. You're learning about her through her conversations with other people and how she reacts to things.
Right, and that she seems like she wants to do a good job, as evidenced by her reading the manual and just kind of being very the good student.
Yeah.
I won't give too much more away. I know it's on Tubi right now, which is great.
Yeah, it's on. You can rent it on iTunes.
iTunes,
all
okay.
that stuff too.
Where did the idea for The Last Shift come from?
It came from, I had made 2 other movies in Florida at the time, and I got to know that sound crew very well that we had worked with. And I thought that I could really challenge them and collaborate with them on something that was very sound driven. That was the main idea behind Last Shift that started. It was like, how can Scott and I wrote that together, Scott Poyley. How can we tell a story that is 50% audio? And to me, audio really creeps people out. You really get under their skin if you can get into the audio of the room. So we designed that movie to be very contained and very driven by sound. So that's where it all started from. And then I think originally I had said, hey, we should do this movie at a dispatch office because that would be a lot of communicating with it on a dispatch, with dispatchers and on the phone a lot. And it morphed in, we found this location before we wrote the script. We're like, okay, we have this great police station that's decommissioned in Florida. And then we started to cater the script around it and kind of morphed into what Last Shift became. And with the antagonist in that film, I thought, the Manson family, we knew kind of morphed in, what if it was this cult? And I was like, well, cults are scary, but what if they were ghosts? If the Manson family were ghosts, that would be even scarier.
Do you think if you hadn't found that location, it would have been a different movie, or you were planning to make that movie regardless?
It probably would have become a different movie because it was not the easiest thing to find a decommissioned police station, and I don't think we wanted to fake it. We didn't want to, because there's a lot of unique things in a police station with the holding cells and the offices, and we if we had found like a fire department or a fire station that was decommissioned, we probably would have turned it into a different movie. I think that location had a lot to do with what it became.
What's the biggest difference between The Last Shift and Malum?
Well, budget size was the first thing. We made Last Shift for a very small amount of money, and it was, when we did it at the time, we had made 2 bigger budget films in that area, and when you make a bigger budget film, you give away a lot of the rights when you're selling it and things like that. And we wanted to retain as much of the Last Shift as we could. And so that was my approach to that. And it was also a challenge, like what could we do on such a small budget and retain a lot more of the ownership of it. So, it ended up becoming my most popular movie at the time. And maybe those restrictions is what made it all that more creative between Scott and I and the whole crew, and keeping it limited, keeping the crew limited. So that was the first thing, budget, right? We had a much larger budget on Malum to kind of go back and revisit the story, but also tell it in a completely different way. I see them as two completely different movies. They have the same basic premise. If I was to throw someone an elevator pitch, they'd sound very similar. But I never felt like I was making the same movie when I was making Malum. It felt like a completely different experience. And again, the location, we found a decommissioned police station in Kentucky, and it's like 100 times the size of the one we had in Florida. It was so much bigger, and it gave us so many more locations to play with. So I think just scope and scale is the biggest thing between them. And then also the approach of giving more to the characters. I said Last Shift was very sparse on development. In Malum, we wanted to create more of a mythology of both the villains and the protagonists and let people get to know the characters a lot more.
Just out of curiosity, are there a lot of like decommissioned government buildings that you can find for filming?
I don't know. We probably not, but we got lucky with, they knew, because I think a lot of movies take the approach of, well, we'll just find any building that works. Let's get where we're going to shoot. You kind of decide where you're going to shoot, and then you're like, okay, well, let's find a building that's going to match it as close as possible. And talking with a Welcome Villain made Malum, I said very early on, hey, we shot the first one in a police station. We need to do that again for this film. Because if that felt authentic, this one has to as well. And if it's going to be a bigger film, we have to at least start there. So that was kind of they had an investor in Kentucky, and they put that out early. Hey, are there any empty police stations in Kentucky? And then it just came back that there was a very recently empty, it was the city police station. So it was in the heart of downtown Louisville. So we got lucky that way because it's a massive building, and we were surrounded by a lot of infrastructure, and the new police station wasn't that far away. They just happened to move somewhere else. So it was a cool experience that we could work in a facility that had so much to offer, including much larger facilities with cells and holding facilities and things like that.
What's your argument for The Last Shift being better than Malum?
I'm pretty honest about my interpretation of the movies, because to me, I'm just one person. Every audience member is going to have a different take on a movie. I think Last Shift is a scarier film because it's so intimate and contained. So and the score is much different. It's approached in a very different way. So if someone's looking to, sit at home alone and put on their headphones or put on their stereo and watch this movie in the dark, Last Shift is going to creep them out in a different kind of way. It's going to get under their skin, and it's going to make you not want to sleep that night. Malum is more of a thrill ride, and it's going to offer them a more visual experience. If people like special effects, special makeup effects, if people like to see more gruesome things, and I'm not saying, yes, it's a gorier film, but it's a trippier film. They're going to see things with special makeup effects. They're going to see monsters they haven't seen before, and they're going to be scared in that way. And you're on a journey that is much more visceral in Malum. So you may be more tense watching Malum. And you will probably be much more invested in the lead character, who is also named Jessica Lauren in that film. I think that's where Malum stands out. And it's a completely different experience than the previous film, Last Shift.
Did you take into consideration, the changes? I mean, both of the films are almost close to a decade apart, and how the world had changed so much in so many ways. Were there things that you incorporated, or you just really wanted to stay close to the story and the protagonist's journey and not infuse it with anything that was going on in the world?
When I, started talking to Scott about, hey, we're thinking about revisiting this story, I said to him, police are looked at in a different way now. That was for sure part of it. But, that the core of Last Shift was the police station. We knew we were keeping that, so we're just, now we are 10 years later, we're not going to change it. We're going to just deal with how things are. Because, controversy around police had heightened a lot. And that was something that informing the character's journey was how we addressed it. Like, we didn't want to hammer anyone over the head with any political things because we had great police on the movie, police training our lead character and our lead actors, doing gun training with police. We were filming at a police station. We worked with the Kentucky police a lot. So it was never meant to be degrading to officers. It's all meant to be through the point of view of the lead character. So that's how we addressed it in writing. If people were going to mirror what the news was saying about police, it was going to be, how would that affect her? Because she loves police. Her father's a police officer. She has a very high regard for officers and for the status of the badge going in. So when you take that approach, the outside forces are the ones that are going to try to manipulate that and tear that down, tear that belief down, or make her feel like her father was a bad person. So it was all, and the, Jessica Sula, who played the character, she did not want to get into that. She was like, I don't care about this stuff. I don't care like how the world, if police are a hot button thing right now, she's like, I don't care. I just want to, I'm playing this character, and the same approach I had. It's like, how do the other characters in the film deal with that around her?
If you had to give us your final verdict, which movie's better, in your opinion?
No pressure. Last Shift or Malum? I don't know if I can. I think Malum's a better film because I think I'm a better director now, and therefore I think it became a better film because of it. It's 10 years later. I've directed several films in between. Malum is a more sophisticated picture, and it is the movie we sought out to make entirely. We didn't have to compromise on it. Every movie you have to make compromises, but we're not making a $30 million movie, so there's always restraints with budget. But as a filmmaker, I just was more confident in the story I was telling, and working with the actors. I think we have some phenomenal performances in Malum that I'm very proud of.
This is a harder question to bring up, but if you're not comfortable talking about it, please stop me. So you have a filmmaking partner that you'd worked with for years, and you wrapped Malum September 1st, 2022?
Yeah, it was a few days. It was like August 27th, I think, is when we stopped.
Okay. And so then 3 days later or a week later, your co-writer and longtime production partner passed away?
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
It was, it's an interesting story because, so Scott, he came from a dance background. He started as a dancer when he was a kid, and he had to stop dancing because he had a heart condition. He had an enlarged heart. When I met Scott, they came down to LA. They had seen my film Dread, him and his producing partner at the time. They came down. I remember the day we were in pre-production, and I punched Scott in the chest, like joking around. We were like playing around or something, and I hit something hard on his chest. He's like, "Oh, that's my pacemaker," and I'm like, "Oh man, I didn't mean to punch you in your pacemaker." And that's when I learned that he had this heart condition. So even then, it was always part of the conversation. You know, it was, he had this pacemaker, he had it for many years. You know, when I met him, he was in his, 30s. And the first film we made together was called Casadega, and he wrote it with his producing partner. And when we did Last Shift, that was our third film together. We're like, well, let's write together. We started writing together. And we wrote quite a bit around that time, quite a few screenplays together. And it was, Scott and I had so much in common, and we got along so well. But this condition was always part of the narrative of kind of my relationship with him. And after Last Shift, he got a heart transplant. And I was in LA, and I remember talking to his wife, and, it was a very tense time, but that heart transplant gave, he had some failure. He had to have a transplant because the pacemaker was failing, the heart was failing. So he was lucky enough to get a transplant. So it's interesting that when the transplant happened, he could dance again. He had a stronger heart. He could do that. He could, he had 2 young daughters, and he got to see them grow up. His daughter, she was on Malum with us, Skylar. So she came down to Kentucky, and Scott did too. It was Scott. Well, I'm jumping ahead a little, but let's say, so this heart transplant, once he had a new, lease on life, and 7 years had gone by, and it started to fail again. So there's this weirdness that it's like, it's not a shock. You have, you're always a little bit prepared because you know he has this condition, and you also know transplants don't last forever. So when we were talking about doing Malum, and he started to get this cough again, he was in Florida, I was in LA, because you get this kind of, when you're in congenital heart failure, you get a cough. And he started to get this cough, and he was nervous that it was happening again. But, so when the doctors, they're like, yes, okay, the heart's like rejecting, so we're going to treat you, and then you're going to get a transplant list again. During that time is when we started working on Malum. We started writing Malum together, so we're spending a lot of time together again. So it's a strange, bittersweet thing, because he got 7 years that he may have not gotten before from that first heart, and got to see his children grow up out of those young ages to young women, and his oldest daughter, literally, she graduated high school, and she's going to film school now, and that was all at that same exact, first week of September. She had just started school, when he passed away. So of course it's tough to lose such a close friend and writing partner, and someone who I'd worked with a lot. But on the flip side, I guess you try to be positive and grateful that his eldest daughter is very passionate about kind of carrying that torch of film, and she grew up on sets. So I kind of look to her as she's remained very positive of I learned so much from my dad, and now I'm going to carry that torch. So that's really what it's about. It wasn't a shock because we had so much history with it, but of course it's tough.
Does it make you less cautious now, knowing that the time is of the essence? Doesn't matter who it is, but...
Yeah, for sure. I think, when you lose, he is young, he was 40, we're the same age, so he was 44 when he passed away, and it's, it is it makes you just less afraid to do what you want to do, right? You just you kind of have to go for it and do what you love, and make sure you're always being grateful, right, for what you're doing and what you have.
Malum is the first project you had to finish without Scott, essentially?
Well, the first that we did together, yeah. I have done, because he was based in Florida and I was in LA, we're always doing our own things. And it had been a while since we had written together at the time, and Malum kind of brought us back together to revisit Last Shift again. It was, literally, I was talking to Scott the day that he passed away, he passed away the next morning, and that evening we were talking about the drives. Like, we had these horrible drives for post-production, and we were like, we gotta get new drives. I started editing with our assistant editor, and the drives weren't working. It's like, okay, I'm gonna work on getting new drives, and then we got the news the next morning. His wife called me, and we had just started post-production. So it was that process of like, okay, let me take some time off, because I went down to Florida to be with the family, and we had like a celebration of life there. And we put together, it was almost like a show, because his wife, Mary, really wanted to, like, he had done all these creative things in his life. We almost put on a show for this. It wasn't, it was not a funeral, it was a celebration of life. And we spent a lot of time putting his videos together and things like that. So that was a surreal experience to kind of go into that world for a week, take a couple of weeks off of the movie, then come back and get into the editing process again. But yeah, it was different being in Florida, because we did a lot of the post in Florida that we usually do with the sound team there, and having him not around during that process.
Any final thoughts on collaboration? I mean, it's hard for great bands to stay together, businesses to stay together, and you always hear, well, I had a rift with my producing partner, whatever. But it sounds like you really formed a special relationship.
Yeah, because we had the same sensibilities in writing. And I think you knew that right away. Like when he had read something of mine, because I had read his stuff, but then read the stuff that he had wrote alone, and then he had read stuff that I had written alone. He was like, oh, we have a similar voice. And when you find people that you have a similar voice with, it's easy to write. And I think, I enjoy writing by myself, but I also like bouncing off someone. So the next thing I could do, my wife is an actress, and she's a creator and a writer. So it's like, now I write with my wife, which is the best partner you can have while writing. So it's a good collaboration. How again?
Are you an only child?
Well, no, but I kind of felt like I grew up an only child, because like I'm 10 years apart from my youngest brother. So I have a younger brother. So there, in those first 10 years of your life, I was an only child.
So you enjoy your own company?
Yeah, for sure.
What are your rules for telling a good story?
I think a lot of writers, we write to entertain ourselves first. I think I watch movies. I've watched movies my entire life, and you create this encyclopedia in your head of like what speaks to you as an artist and what you go back to time and time again. So I think for me, writing a good story, it always comes down to concept first. What is that 10,000-foot view of an idea, and what makes it stand out? That's for me as a creator. And I'm very much about structure. When I'm writing with Natalie, because she's coming from an actress point of view, she's very much about character, which is completely true. That I think you can have a bad movie, but if you have good characters, people are still gonna love it in some ways. But on the flip side, you can have some great characters, but you can have a very bad structure and story, and people will tune out. So I think you really have to know your beginning, middle, and end very early on, and that they thematically line up, and that you're saying some kind of message with the story you're telling. You're entertaining, but I think as a creator, you also have to have that backbone of, why am I telling the story? I think is important.
When you're working on a story, how do you know it's developed enough or not developed enough?
Yeah, that's tricky. I think it's different for everybody. And when I write, I'm not the fastest writer. Sometimes I am. It's very true. And I say this, I have this conversation with myself all the time. Like, I wish I was faster, but I'm like, but I am fast sometimes. And over the years, I think when you're a young writer, a lot of people just dive into writing a script. And I've always been a militant note taker. Like I will write things down on a napkin, or, you know, now we have phones. It's a constant notes in my phones about when an idea strikes me. And, you know, eventually you get enough of these ideas, like when you're driving or in the shower, and you're kind of ruminating on this concept. Because for me, it's always the concept. Like I have I start with the elevator pitch, essentially. That's always how I come up with an idea. Is I like to tell high concept stories, at least when I'm writing specs and writing on my own, or writing with Natalie. You know, if we're gonna bring an idea out to the town, I want it to be high concept. I want someone to be able to get it and be like, oh, that's clever. I get that. Oh, it feels fresh. So I really just simmer in that and take all these notes. And then once I feel like I have enough notes in the 3 acts, or finally know where it's going to end, I'll do a very detailed treatment, which I never used to do. And I, you know, if anyone's a young writer and doesn't like that structure, I tell them, please write a treatment. You know, because you learn from your mistakes. You know, oftentimes when you write a script without an outline or a treatment, even a 6-page document, doesn't have to be long, as long as you know where you're going. I caution them, you probably won't finish the script. You may have a great first act, but you're going to lose yourself somewhere around act 2. So I think in this process of deciding, you know, when's enough, like when do you have developed enough? For me, I have to write the treatment and have every beat almost in there before I'll sit down and write a screenplay now. And that can take months. You know, I may spend 3 months developing and then writing a treatment. But then the script writing process is usually very, very fast because of it, and making sure it's all there. Because I think when you know you have a good idea, you have to decide if you have a good movie before you should sit down and write. And that's always going to be a struggle, deciding, like, I think you have to have enough on the page and developing. That's when you know enough is enough for me, is that it's all there. I have it all, and I'm ready to sit down and write a screenplay.
Are there certain things you do to get yourself into a headspace? If it's a thriller, if it's more of a fantasy? I mean, writing at a coffee shop, is that really going to get you in the right headspace if it's a psychological thriller with a lot of scares?
I tend not to go to the coffee shop unless I'm struggling. You know, if I'm struggling with something and because I'm definitely the kind of person, also being an editor, when I'm writing or editing, I will sit in a chair and forget to eat. You know, I can sit in a chair for 8 hours and work and enjoy that process and not get up, right? So if you're hitting your head against a wall, I'd go to a coffee shop and do that, just to kind of get yourself out of this bubble. But for me, it's about watching other movies. You know, what if I'm writing a movie in a certain genre, I'll watch movies that will inspire me in that genre, and I think that's cool. Like you say, that's not a waste of time. Like watching movies is part of the process, you know. So if you're, you know, getting up at 10 a.m. to start writing, and instead you're putting on that movie, to me that's the same thing. You know, that's part of the journey. And the other part is finding my playlist, which is a big part of my writing process. Early on, I'll start popping music into a playlist with the name of the movie, and I'll eventually have a whole bunch of music in there, and that will be the voice of my movie. Either if it's, you know, it can have lyrics, you know, because sometimes a lot of writers don't like to write with lyrics because it kind of gets in their head, or it will be scores from movies. But I do both. You know, if I'm writing a movie that I picture having a lot of contemporary music in it, I'll listen to that music when I'm writing. So that gets me into the headspace a lot.
Like some examples of the music or artists? I'm just curious.
It's different for every movie. I'd say for thrillers and stuff, if I'm writing a horror film, I'll tend to find other soundtracks. You know, like right now, my wife and I are writing a pitch, and I'm listening to the Candyman remake, the music in that movie. It's technically a sequel, but the latest Candyman film. I thought it had great music, so it's in the same vein, you know. And it's also, what are those songs you get in your head and let you just completely zone out on the page? You almost don't hear it anymore, but it becomes the soundtrack for what you're writing.
You worked with Clive Barker when you first came to LA?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
What are some things that you've kind of infused in your storytelling and filmmaking that's always stayed with you?
I think, you know, I worked with Clive, you know, I still keep in touch with Clive, and I worked with Clive, it was almost, you know, between 10 and 12 years. It was a long time that I got to be close to how he did things. I wish I could have watched him direct a movie, but that was beyond his directing years. He was producing, and he was writing his novels, he was painting. But he, you know, listening to the stories of like when they made Candyman and Hellraiser, and learning, you know, if you're making a scary movie, he's like, you have to scare the audience every 7 minutes. It sounds so like scientific, but you know, that was a lesson I always remembered. Like, don't leave your audience hanging. And you know, I had watched Candyman when it came out in theaters, you know, years before I ever knew I was going to meet Clive, and I thought the kinds of movies he makes are very sophisticated in their storytelling, in their character. To me, Candyman's a drama, but it has, you know, a core love story. It has very compelling elements of mystery, and it's also terrifying. So I think that's something that I always want to do when I'm making movies, is give the audience characters they can love and care about. I've never been interested in making a movie where your characters are disposable, which was very much a tradition of horror for a long time, and still is in a lot of movies. Like, oh, let me make a bunch of unlikable people so I can slaughter them, and the audience will feel all right about it. I'm like, well, why not make a whole bunch of likable characters that the audience really loves and slaughter them anyways, so that the audience has an emotional reaction to losing something instead of just feeling like okay about it. Those were definitely lessons that I learned from him.
I think you dissected or adapted one of his novels, and it wasn't even something he had asked you to do.
Well, yeah, I started because, you know, working with Clive and starting like reading he had this great library of all his books from different countries on the shelf. So I would consume as much of his content as I could. And he wrote this young adult novel called Thief of Always. And it had been at a few studios. It was at Fox and it was at Universal. And for some reason, people had a hard time. It never got made, and people had a hard time adapting it. And I read that book and I was like, well, this is the movie. The book is so perfect. I don't know what's so hard about writing the script. And so the first thing I did, and I was probably there a year or two at the point, I just adapted it into a screenplay and I gave it to him. And it was literally I had written in college, but not to the extent of, I think as a writer, a young writer, you know, 120 pages sounds like a lot, you know, and I think you have to get over that hump. And Thief of Always was that hump for me. It was just like, okay, well, here's a great book. I'm going to adapt it into a screenplay and retain as much of it as possible because I loved everything in it. So that process was so great because it's like, okay, I can write, and showing it to him and being like, what do you think of this? He's like, well, this is great. This is my book, but it's a screenplay. And that was the start. And I had adapted several of his Pig Blood Blues and Damnation Game. And the one that got made was Dread, which was it was Clive's only psychological thriller. He at the time, he had not done anything without supernatural content or monsters, but Dread was a psychological thriller. And that I was really drawn to that because it was also about people that were close to my age and being in college.
And why are you telling horror stories? Why not action hero or some, complicated romance?
I like to scare people, and I love horror. But truth be told, I don't write a lot of horror. Having been a writer for many, many years, I started writing in children's fantasy adventures and stuff. So a lot of the stuff that I write outside of what I direct isn't horror at all. It's romance and sci-fi and action adventure, and Natalie and I do a lot of that. So I direct horror films because I've always been that guy growing up that loves Halloween and loves special makeup effects, because that's what got me into pursuing horror, was special makeup effects. I love dealing with creating monsters and things like that. But I just get a joy out of creeping people out. Even if it's with friends and I can hide in a closet, I'll do it.
Well, you said your dad would take you to the cinema?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my dad is a big cinephile. And he grew up, he is from an older generation. He had me much later in life, a much younger mother than father. They were 20 years apart. So he saw Frankenstein when it came out. My dad was born in 1930. And so I came up with the Universal monsters, and he loved, he still loves monster movies and things like that. So that was infused in my being very early on. I was also watching, Once Upon a Time in America at 6 years old, or 5, so I was seeing movies and I'm like, do I know what's going on? But I was watching those movies at an early age. My parents were never policing their viewing, right? They weren't like, oh, you can't watch this because it has adult themes or anything. I was just exposed to a lot as a kid. So I still, that all kind of made me who I am, watching these epics at an early age.
If you are writing a story, you may be interested in our new book, the sponsor of today's video. After months of working on a story, have you ever said to yourself, I don't know what my main character wants. Why are my side characters more interesting than my main character? 17 Steps is a workbook-style tool with specific questions to help you dive deep into your main character and story. We've linked up to 17 steps below. Now, back to the video. Anthony, on your website you have a quote: when you stare into the abyss stares back at you.
My wife wrote that quote.
It's a great quote. What is this abyss?
It was definitely about writing. It's that process of, she took there's that picture of me, and that was on Last Shift, when I'm kind of staring over this script and looking into it. And I think that happens in two places. It happens when you're about to write something, when you're page one of that screenplay is that first step. You're staring into that black hole or that white page, and it can be anything. And then I think it happens again when you're about to shoot the movie, and you're looking at that first page, and you're about to turn this into a living, breathing entity. You're like, what will that become? What's going to climb out of the abyss? Is kind of where it comes from, because something's coming out of there. It's going to be good or bad, but something's coming out of it.
Why do you write out of order?
I think it's a process of the note taking, that there are scenes that will pop in your head that are fully fleshed out. And it's also, it stops procrastination, which is a big part of writing. Anything that can, because I could be writing and spend 8 hours on one sentence. Some days, that's part of the process. And maybe your brain just is like, I am not going to stop until I get this right. And I think jumping out of order allows you to get beyond that. When you're like, okay, I'm stuck here. Let's just agree I'm stuck. Tell your mind, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I know what's going to happen in that other scene. So I'm going to recalibrate, and go write that scene. I think that's a good way to get something done. I think the goal, this isn't part of the question, but I think a good thing to do is when it's about that getting over procrastination, is when you sit down to write, make a calendar. Make a calendar and make a deadline for yourself. If you, it's almost mystical in a way that if you write without a deadline, you'll write forever. But I say it's mystical because it surprises me when it works. If I have a screenplay I'm going to write, I'm going to be like, all right, I want to be done with this in 30 days. And I write it down in a calendar and I say, okay, I'm going to do page 1 through 6, day 1, page 7 through 12, day 2. And I put it all in the calendar all the way to page 120, and I'll get there. And I think it's almost like you're telling your brain, I only have this long. And you may have some bad days along the way. You're like, oh, I only got 2 pages done. But you'll find times to make it up if you stick to that schedule.
Have you always been that disciplined?
No, not at all.
But with writing, you are?
That's years of kind of like figuring out the craft of how I work, right? And to duel yourself. You have to find all your flaws. You have to find what you consider your weaknesses, and you have to find ways to combat them. I'm a Gemini too, so it's it's a dueling battle with both sides. But I think I have to let my discipline side win out.
But then you're ambidextrous, and you can do many things.
Yes.
If we follow the charts.
Yeah.
Then you can be up here, but then also be doing something here, and yeah.
I think maybe being a Gemini is part of it. I feel one of my strongest suits as a filmmaker is that I can wear different hats completely independently of the process. I started as a producer. I started as an executive with Clive. I was developing projects with writers and directors. And then after being with him, he always knew I wanted to direct. I always wanted to direct, but I fell into that, and I'd never thought about producing. Learning all those skills as a producer probably helped in this process. But when I'm writing, I'm writing. And then when I'm directing, I throw the script out. It's like as if I hadn't written a page of it. I become someone else. So as a director, there's nothing in that script that's important to me if it's not important for the story at the given moment with the actors I have right then and there. And I think that's been very, very helpful in the filmmaking process. And the same goes for when I finish directing and start editing. If I am editing the picture, it's like, well, who cares? I don't care who directed that movie. Now I'm crafting the movie. I'm wearing a completely different hat. And I can you gotta let go of all that baggage along the way of like, well, that scene was really hard to shoot. It has to go in the movie. And I'm like, no, I don't care. I don't care. It depends on what's gonna make the movie the best it can be at that stage.
Do you ever find you spread yourself too thin?
I don't know. I don't feel like I do, because I think it's in my mind, it's very segmented. I think it's usually in pre-production. Like, you always wish you had more time, because if you're the writer and you're directing, you have a bunch of work to do in prep as a director. But if you're also doing rewrites on the script, then you are splitting your time, and probably spreading myself too thin. I could be rehearsing, but I have to, we had a location change or we lost a location, so I have to write instead. So that is definitely an example of that.
If you were interested in storytelling, you may also like our new book, Story Questions, the sponsor of today's video. It's a story tool that offers you over 1,500 story questions that you can use as story prompts. It's packed with over 40 categories, so whether you are in the brainstorming stages, developing characters, dialogue, or rewriting, it can help you at every stage of the writing process. Think about this statement. Most powerful stories are just great answers to strong questions. We've linked up to story questions in the information section below. Now back to the interview.
How do you name your characters?
Oh man, I hate naming characters. I really do. I'm not a fan of, two things I know I'm not good at: character names and titles. And that's not always consistently, because sometimes the name will pop in my head out of nowhere. It's like fully formed. And I'll write it down. And I'll collect names over the years. And then when I'm starting a script, I'll usually be like, oh, let me see, like, I had a cool name. Let me go see if I like this and see if it fits for the character. So I think that's one thing too, like, take notes again. And at least for me, just completely randomly, a name will pop in my head that it has a clever enunciation or a first and last name that sound good together. I think I did a historical fiction screenplay, and it was one of those movies where you want these characters to stand out, and you're combining names that are both historical but futuristic. And in that process, I think it's really good to do research, right? I'll do this too, and I'm kind of a stickler for, if I know how old my character is, if I know where they are born, I'll go look up statistically what were popular names in that area at that time. And that's often how I come up with names, in a very kind of pragmatic way. And maybe just to create a sense of authenticity.
Right, because in the Northeast, it'd be much different than maybe some part of Colorado or something. And,
Yeah.
And also too, now there's more genderless names.
Yeah.
And let's say in the 80s, everybody had Jen, Tiffany.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely a time period for names.
Because I've read scripts where people are too creative with names, where every other character has this unique name, and you're like, why? Why? Nobody has that. Because sometimes, you can get as realistic as having two characters with the same name. That's tough, but it's completely, how many Daves do you know, right? You may have a friend group with, we had 4 people on Malum who were named Eric, and it's like, that's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes.
What is a set piece?
A set piece for me is, and I think maybe every person has a different example of what they'd call a set piece, but a set piece for me are those tentpole moments in a movie that are designed to attract people to a film in a way. They're the things that are going to show up in the trailer. They're those goalposts that you move towards. That, okay, this is a set piece. It's where something big is happening. It's that big action car chase, or it's that big scare in the basement. And it's complex to do. It's complex to shoot. It's complex to write. And that has always been my definition of what I'd call a set piece, is that it's those things that are going to end up in the trailer and things that are going to get you to the end of the movie.
Can you provide an example of how you create a set piece within your films?
Yeah, it can be strategic. I think everything is set up and payoff. Everything you set up in a movie, you should be dropping hints, things that you want to pay off. So I think in a set piece, there's a lot of shoe leather in between. You're doing development, you're doing character development, and you're getting to something that you're staging. I think in horror, you're setting up a good magic trick. You're providing information so that the trick is going to land in the set piece. And you're giving the audience enough detail that when they get there, they know where they are in space and time. And because if someone's confused in a moment, you're not going to scare them. You're not going to be able to scare someone if they're not quite sure where they are and what the stakes are. So you're doing all that leading up to this moment. They're like, okay, how does this happen? Like in Malum, for example. This is a good example that I'll give away. There's a large sow in Malum that comes to the police station. It's a pig that's tied up outside. And, our character is nice and caring, and she doesn't want to leave this pig outside, so she brings it inside. And she gives it water. She finds it a place to go, even though people tell her, don't let it in, we don't know what it is. So she locks it in a room with water, and then, okay, well, we've now set this pig up. We set up how it sounds, how it moves. It was like a 650-pound sow. It's very large. So that leads to a scene in the movie where she's now getting all these revelations about the villains, and you're getting sucked into this. And down here where the pig is getting out, someone let the pig out, and it's walking down the hall. It's getting closer to where she is, and we're like, oh, I know this pig. I've given the information. I know everything I think I know about this pig. And then we're getting sucked in with her story. And in the background, we see the door open. But she's too enthralled in what's going on. She's learning things about her past and about the villains. And then that door opens, and we're on her face, and we're creeping in. And then we hear the pig squeal. And it startles her, but she looks down at the pig. And the audience, right, what are they expecting to see? The pig. But it's not the pig, it's this dead girl on the ground. And that is all part of those setups and payoffs that now lead to this set piece of her getting away from this creature that's coming after her, and this embodiment of the pig, and it's chasing her through several rooms, and how is that going to come to a climax? So to me, that was one of the big set pieces of Malum that took us through from all this setup, and now we're paying it all off.
Right, and with the last shift, there was a lot of hearing a sound and a tight corridor, and it takes you on this ride of like, you don't know what's at the other end. It may be nothing, maybe something, and so.
And I think at the end of each set piece, you have to let the audience sigh. You have to let them exhale. And you have to give them a breather before you start laying the seeds for the next set piece. And let them kind of just either be with the character in a quiet moment, or get a new piece of information that's going to take the story in a different direction. But I think you have to press that reset button after the end of each set piece.
Once you have a set piece, how do you structure it into your story?
That's an interesting question, because some of it is like the cart leading the horse in a way. And I think at least myself, I create these good moments that I'm like, okay, oh, that'd be great. This would be a great set piece. Oh, that would be a great set piece. And you're creating them along the way. You have a basic idea of what your story is, but then the challenge is often, how do you thread it together? And that's, I think, discipline of, you have to, even though it is a bit of the cart leading the horse, you have to erase all that for the viewer. You have to make it feel completely natural and progressive as the story goes. And I think that's just always tearing apart your own work, always looking for the holes and the flaws. Because if you do have these set pieces you want to hit, and I'm sure every filmmaker goes through this when you're making a big action movie or doing anything. You have, an Aquaman, you're going to have these big set pieces where Aquaman, rides the seahorse and he's battling the giant crab. Okay, well, how do we get to that moment organically? How do we get from this moment to this moment? And you have to make sure you're getting there in an organic way. And that's the magic behind writing, right? Is that you have to craft a story and make it feel like it's all happening in the now, even though you know where it's going to end. But for the viewer, you want them to feel like they're in the moment, and we're taking the right steps to get there. And that's the challenge. I don't know if there's an easy way to solve that. I just think you have to be very disciplined in tearing apart your own work and having, people you trust read it and making sure everything goes together. Because I've been there too, where it's like, okay, I'm shoehorning this in. It doesn't fit. I want to have this, but it's got to go. So it goes.
Would you say that's what most of the notes are in your phone or wherever? They're set pieces?
I think so. It's set pieces, or it's lines of dialogue. It's little things like that. You may start with just a line, finding the voice of your characters. But yeah, a lot of it is those big moments that kind of jump off the page at you.
When you're out somewhere, at the grocery store or wherever, do you hear a line of dialogue and then go in your car in the parking lot and I gotta put that in?
Yeah. I think good writers should always be like listening to the world around them, because people say crazy stuff, right? And that's a big part of it. It's just kind of seeing how people are in the world. And I mean, I'd probably get accused of staring at people too much, because it's like also being solitary a lot. I'll just watch, like people watch is, you get a lot of ideas that way.
What does world building mean to you?
I think it's it has a couple different meanings, right? If I'm doing a fantasy or science fiction story, the world building is much more vast, because there are so many elements you could delve into. If you're telling a futuristic story, is it our world or is it another world? Is it our timeline or is it another timeline? So you have to really create how people interact, how people live, what is the technology of that world. Sci-fi is tremendous world building. For something like Malum, which is in some ways our world askew, because Scott and I created a lot of terminology for that, for our villains that didn't exist. We didn't want it to be generic. We didn't want to use things like Satan or the devil or, for our cult in that movie. We wanted to world build. We wanted to create a mythology. We had to create, and you have to say it with conviction, like people have said it 100 times before. So that was a big part of that process with Malum, is the terminology is something an audience wouldn't hear, but to our characters, it feels commonplace. So I think that's a big part of the world building, is making sure when it's coming out of your characters' mouths, it feels settled and lived in, and also not confusing the audience in a way that they're like, well, you have to be careful if you choose to world build and not give enough context. You may confuse people. So I think there's always that juggle of, I'm building worlds here, but I'm also informing my audience enough that they follow it.
Don't you think that world building is just as important as character building?
Definitely, yeah. I think world building is part of structure. It's being very disciplined about the structure of your story and the world you're creating in every scene. Character building, if people don't like your characters, I can watch a movie and not like characters, but still be entertained by the story. And I can watch a movie with great characters, but not like the movie because the story let me down in a way. So for me as a writer, I think structure is the core of it, and the world building is such a big part of it. I know my wife would disagree and say it's character, so that's a good balance. But yeah, I think for me that world building is integral to kind of getting your story going.
What are the steps it takes to build a world? Whether it's a police station, whether it's a graveyard, or some type of afterlife?
I think during production, especially, of course, because that's when it becomes a reality. On the page, it's just amorphous in a way, and you may write in a way like, when you're writing, you'd be like, okay, there's a door here and there's a staircase here, and this is the geography in my mind, and you have to throw that all out the window when you get to location scouting. And that's your first step in world building, is your choices of location, and what does each one look like, and how do they complement each other along the way? I think shooting in Florida is a perfect example, right? I shot 2 movies in Florida back to back, and one was about the town of Cassadaga, which is a real town of Cassadaga, Florida is a hotspot for psychics. They all live in this one town called Cassadaga. That movie was Spanish moss and swamp, and it had a feel, or you want to create a feel. So all the locations were based around that. I made another movie called Missionary, which was about kind of like a Fatal Attraction with a Mormon missionary. That movie was very industrial. Our lead character worked at a car graveyard, and she repaired cars, and there was a lot of factories, and so it looks completely different, but they're shot within a 10-mile radius. That's world building in real terms. You have to be mindful of those locations you're choosing. We're choosing trailer parks and factories and junkyards. We're trashing cars and things. That's part of the world building that you have to be really mindful of. And then it's working with your production designer and making sure every element in your character's surroundings is reflective of them in real life. I think that's something you can, especially if you're working fast and furious, you could not be mindful of like what's on the shelf, what is on, what's in the kitchen, what are the things, what are they carrying in their pockets, what's in their purse, it can't just be a bunch of random things just for set dressing. You really have to take every location and say, okay, who is my character? What would be in their home? Because that also defines the actor when they get to set. A lot of actors will get to set and that will inform them about who their character is and how they can live in that moment and kind of forget everything else. As long as if it feels more real to them, you're going to get the best performance out of them as possible. So that's also a big part of world building. For me as a director, all my world building is about informing the actor's performance so they can live it as real as possible.
In The Last Shift, there were parts where it was very bleak and there was literally almost nothing in there. Hence, a police station that was closed down or being moved or whatever. And so you felt the starkness and this like desolate world, which made it even scarier.
Yeah. I think in The Last Shift especially, because when we got to that location, it was all white. It was all white walls. And, we could have been like, oh, well, let's paint all the walls darker colors. Well, we decided to embrace it. We're like, not a lot of horror movies have the lights on a lot. We had the lights on a lot in that movie. Bright fluorescence, white walls. It was kind of the opposite of what you'd see in a lot of horror films. And we just decided to go with that for a lot of it. And then when we wanted it dark, we just shut off all the lights. Just shut off all the lights and she's with her flashlight, which is another part of like that world building process. Where is she going to shine that light and what's she going to see?
What are some mistakes that writers get wrong with world building?
I would say that maybe some writers don't think outside their characters. The characters, there's the dialogue on the page, and then there's the descriptions of what's going on. I think a lot of, as a writer, you're always trying to say very little in a screenplay. You don't want to you want to keep blocks of, you want the white on the page to show, and you want to be mindful of how long these blocks are. And you don't want to give a reader too much information. But so if you can find the balance between striking an image in your reader's head that conveys world, just think of yourself as how you live life, right? How do we, what's tactile about our experience? When we step outside, we go to the beach and we're hit with that gust of wind and we smell that salt water in the air. That sets a world building tone. So if you can create that on the page and make your reader feel like they're watching a movie, then that's something to be mindful of. Not just letting the dialogue tell the story, because you can get carried away and let dialogue tell the story, but you have to be really mindful of what's going on between the dialogue. And some executives won't read that. They may just read the dialogue, but it's good to have it there so in your mind.
What about world building where it's too cliche, that maybe the background's too perfect, the person would be messier in real life, and you've made them too perfect?
Yeah, I think flaws, right? You want to create as many flaws in your character as possible because that's realistic, and you want to to be reflective in what's going on in the world around them. You know, how do they get into their car? You know, what is in their car when they get into it? You know, these are reflections of our daily life. If someone has a pristine car that's clean, that's informative of their world. But not everyone's going to be like that. No, right? Like everyone's going to have a different car. Everyone's going to have different things in their glove box, right? And I think you have to build that into the moments of character on the page.
Why is a female protagonist usually the best for horror?
That's an easy one. I mean, in the sense, I do think as, and maybe it's changing a little now, but I think as a collective species, people care more about women. Men in our history have been disposable. You know, men go to fight war. And I grew up with a father that was much older, so those things are instilled in my life. If I'm walking down the sidewalk with my wife, she's always on the inside. If she moves to the street side, I'm going to move again. And I think as a collective, there's a lot of that in our collective whole as a society, that when a female is in jeopardy, I think people tend to care more. No matter how much they care about the characters, we can love the male characters, but it's always going to be inherently in horror. People feel like a woman is more susceptible to being hurt or overpowered. And it's also good in horror to play with those expectations, right? So I just watched a movie that kind of irritated me. It was a fine movie, but they created this great sequence where this female character was ready for the attack. So ready that at every turn she was ready to combat the opponent. And I loved that, except they still killed her, which drove me nuts. Because I was like, no, like if you're going to create a character that is so ready, let them win, because if I want to be excited by that. So I think now you can really subvert those expectations about female characters. But I think as a whole, that's really the reason why, is that we've grown up through years and years of war, and it's always men on the front line, which is changing more now. But I think it's going to take a while for those expectations to change.
Okay, how would we explain Get Out?
Get Out? Well, I mean, you can tell, I made Dread, which was all male characters, you know. You can tell a very compelling story with a male character. I don't know if I was scared in Get Out. I love Get Out, it's a great movie, but I don't know if I felt fear for him as much as I would. But you can tell great movie. I mean, American Werewolf in London has a male protagonist, but yeah, my first film I directed had all male protagonists, like as the leads, and putting them in jeopardy. So it's also challenging, more challenging that way.
In horror, how does a writer determine who the protagonist is and what do they want above all else?
I think it's important that, you know, each character you're writing has, especially your lead, has a dramatic need, right? They have that want. And it can't be, I want to live, right? Almost every horror movie has the same agenda. I want to survive. But that can't be your lead character's dramatic need, right? Because, you know, unless they're waking up in a situation where they're already in jeopardy, you know, then maybe that is their only dramatic need. But most movies aren't like that. Most movies are people going about their lives, and then the movie happens to them. So I think you have to make sure your character, what is their dramatic need on a daily basis? You know, that's not going to go away. You know, is it to get the best as an education for their kids? You know, is it to make sure their kids are protected? In Malum, she wants to find out what happened to her father. Right, that's her dramatic need from beginning to end, and at the end of the movie, she gets that answer. So I think if you have that question in the first act, you need to answer it in the third act. You need to give them that answer. Not to say you need to. I think you can tell lots of good movies where if you're intentionally not giving them that answer. But I think that's mindful. You know, you can't get caught up in your story. You have to get caught up in your characters' lives. You know, who are they before the movie starts?
Is a horror screenwriter concerned with whether their character is likable?
I mean, from my point of view, they should be. I know it's not always the tradition of horror, and we talked about this earlier a bit. You know, I think early on in horror, it was the tropes of, well, if our characters commit sins, then we're allowed to kill them. It's a cautionary tale. And a lot of movies don't like to do bad things to good people. But, you know, life does bad things to good people all the time. So I think you have to determine what kind of movie you're telling. You know, how heavy is it in horror? Are you a movie like what I like to call like popcorn horror? You know, is a lot of slashers are popcorn horror, where you want to entertain your audience. You don't want to make them cry. You know, and if a character is beloved too much, you may do that. You know, you may lose your audience. I think Scream was always great at. Scream was one of those first slasher movies that turned that on its head intentionally. They made a bunch of characters that we didn't want to see die, and they didn't kill them at the end of the movie. And that's why they got so many sequels out of that series, and they're still getting sequels, is because they created really strong characters that people got behind and continued to, you know, because we didn't want to see them harmed, which was rare at the time. But I always think that's a better approach, is to make a movie about people that are lovable and likable.
Are there different levels of horror fans? You said popcorn sort of horror films, slasher films, versus some obscure, versus a thriller, you know, psychological, deep psychological thriller.
For sure. I think horror, above any other genre, has thousands of niches, and they have a fan base that is willing to watch almost anything. Now, you have mainstream people. I think horror, and I, you know, again, this is like my time with Clive and the old school horror filmmakers, is that horror was really created so that a guy could ask a girl out on Friday night and try to hold their hand at the movie theater, right? It was designed to create intimacy between the audience. And I think that's what made it popular with teens, is because a teenager in the 50s and 60s could be like, oh, I'm going to ask Mary out to see a movie, but it's going to be a scary movie, so she's going to want to hold my arm. And I think that is the primal beginning of you know, besides the elements of like flirting with the taboo or getting as close to death as possible. I think in the real world aspect, that was the beginning of it. And horror audiences are you know, you have those mainstream audiences that are still like that. I just want to go see a movie, I want to be scared, and that's it. But there's a huge aspect of the audience that is seeing, consuming everything year round, you know, and that they love that experience, that visceral experience of being terrified. And what's great about horror is that you could make a movie like, right, Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the time was so gritty and raw, or you could shoot a movie on an iPhone today with no light, and a horror audience is going to want to see it. They don't care if it was made for $15, $30, $40 million. It could be made for $500, and they'll spend that hour and a half watching it if it's going to give them a terrifying experience. And there's not a lot of genres that can do that. You know, I think drama can do it to a certain extent because it's a human connection. Like Once was a great example of that drama that came out, and it was like shot on a horrible video camera, and it looks so raw, but it creates an intimacy. But mostly that is going to be horror, that people are willing to watch bad horror too, you know, just for the experience of it.
And are those the ones that would go to a horror convention? Those are the tried and true.
Sure. Yeah, I think that well, I mean, I'm the same way. I love Halloween. I've always loved Halloween, and creating that. I don't know what it is inside us that when we're young, right, attracts us to that, and we just want to be around it. We want to be around monsters and people in hockey masks. I don't know why, but it's a huge part of the horror genre is that a collective experience.
Sure, and there's a similarity to being an actor because you get to be someone else for Halloween.
Yes, yeah.
And no one's, they'll judge you, but it's Halloween.
It's Halloween, yeah.
You can
you get to be somebody else. You can act like someone else entirely on Halloween. Yeah.
What is your standard for every movie that you make?
I have a high standard. I mean, I feel like any film I'm going to make, I don't want anyone to question what the budget was. I think you have to go in, I think you have to know your limitations and make sure that people are watching the scene and they're like, oh, this is good if, for a low budget movie or for an indie movie. I try to make sure the production value is as high as a big studio production. I just think and if you can't overextend yourself. I think that's what a lot of first-time filmmakers, that's the mistake they make, is they try to make a big movie on a small budget and you can see all the holes in it. You can't allow yourself to be in that situation because an audience will tune out if you can tell a low-budget story and make a good movie. Should you be doing car chases and big shootouts? If you can't afford to do it, you shouldn't do it. You should write a different story. I think that's a big part of the James Cameron method of making a movie. You're always striving to do the best you can. You're going beyond. If you shoot for the stars and you're not happy with it, but you've shot so far that for the audience they won't see the difference. They'll be happy with it.
So then to really question, should this just be a one location shot, a film, excuse me, so you're not overextending yourself with dramatic car chases, as you say?
Yeah, that's exactly what we did for Last Shift. We didn't have the budget to do that kind of stuff. So we were like, well, how do we basically stay in this one location but make a really entertaining movie that people aren't questioning, oh, this feels low budget or this is boring. I think that's the first part of knowing your target range for money, what's your budget size you're aiming for, how much can you raise, how much can you get, how much are the investors putting into it, and then cater your film around that in a way. Even if you have a written script already, don't just go into production with it. Just make sure you're not overextending yourself on the page.
Were you tempted to do that at all for The Last Shift? Maybe we could squeeze in a street scene or something that, aside from, some of the beginning?
Last Shift, I wasn't, because I had done, Dread was my first feature and it had a sizable budget. And I learned a lot from that movie because, it was like a 112-page script. And the process of making that movie, you're getting everything on the page. I learned that the way I wrote was very dense. I fit a lot of details on a page. And when you're shooting that, it makes it much longer. You're getting all these little character moments or you're getting close-ups on things. And I ended up cutting 45 minutes out of that movie because it was too long. Now, in your mind, you're like, 45 minutes, that's days and days of work that you could have spent somewhere else. You could have spent that money on something else. That's just wasted money that's not ending up on the screen. So when we did Last Shift, we shot a 69-page screenplay. Most people would shoot a 90-minute movie, a 90-page screenplay. And even when we showed it to some people, like some investor friends, they were like, it's only 69 pages. It's like, yeah, I know, trust me, that's exactly the page it needed to be. And it ended up being 90 minutes on the nose. I didn't cut anything out of that movie. I used every frame we shot. because we couldn't. The movie would have been too short. So that we were very disciplined on that movie.
How do you challenge yourself with each new project?
I spend a lot of time on performances. I think the two places I try to extend myself on are again, working with actors. I love working with actors. It's the reason why I like to direct. And I think when I watch a movie, I'm always gauging my success on the performance of the actor. And did they get to where they need to go? Are they giving a convincing performance? Are they comfortable? Are they pushing themselves as an actor? So when I'm in the editing process, I'm looking at all that. And then the other ways is with camera. I think because I'm so performance-based, I have to be very mindful of what am I doing with the camera? Is it interesting enough? How are we challenging ourselves with the angles and the, can you shoot this? I like it when I'm not very rigid when I make a movie. I'm very loose. I don't storyboard a lot. I'll storyboard maybe the scares, some of the big actions pieces, stuff like that. But I kind of like to let the actors dictate how we shoot a movie. What are they doing in the blocking, and then shoot around it. And you have to plan for certain shots with equipment, and you want to get those shots. But for a lot of it, I like it to just come out of the moment. And sometimes when you're watching the actors, you have ideas about like, well, why don't we shoot this with one take? Why don't we do this whole scene in a oneer and let the camera move around them? And sometimes you can save time that way. You spend time getting it right, but once you get it right, you end up saving a lot on not covering it in other ways. So that's always, for me, is like I like to be in the moment and challenge myself in the moment and always be kind of present to pick up on the special things that happen in a movie and not be so rigid. So that's always part of that pushing myself, is just constantly being in the moment with the actors.
And does part of not being rigid mean letting an actor come up with their own dialogue if they say a line slightly off?
Oh, for sure.
Works? Yeah. Okay.
I always tell actors, like, do not worry about the dialogue on the page. Say it in your own words. And also I like to play with the actors, and I'll tell them, are you comfortable with improv? Like, because I think you'll often get the most genuine performances if you tell one actor to do something completely different, and then you get the reaction from the person on camera. So they're never quite sure. And also that creates an air of like, well, I have to be on my toes, in a sense, like be ready to play and allow yourself to be surprised by things. But yeah, dialogue to me, whenever I tell an actor that's auditioning, I'm like, forget the dialogue. Like, do you know the intent of the scene? Then just say it in your own words. And certainly when you're shooting, you have to be mindful of plot, but you don't have to do that on every take. You can allow actors to play on different takes. And also I like to go beyond the scene, not call cut when they're expecting you to call cut. And you kind of just let it keep going and see what will happen. So that's all kind of about being in the moment there.
How do you keep up with technology?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not the best at keeping up with technology. I can be honest about that. And because I don't shoot a lot myself, it's something I have to be more mindful of. I think, when I'm very much the kind of filmmaker that is, I like to give my departments their space, in the sense that I want them to all perform at their best. I don't want to micromanage things. So especially with my, it's about being with anytime I'm approaching a new project, it's getting early on in prep with your DP and almost learning the technology then. Well, what's at our disposal? What would I like to do with this movie? To me, I'm just thinking like as a creative, in the sense of this is what I want, this is what I'd like to do, and I let the experts in their field tell me the best way to achieve it. So for me, technology is Final Draft and making sure my updates up to date, you know, and Premiere, making sure, you know, the editing software is up to date, but camera, it's really about me speaking with the DP and getting on the same page with them.
How does the financing behind movies work?
Each movie is different, and I've been a part of almost every category. You know, I think if your business is to be in the studio system, then you're gonna put your concentration on if you're a writer, you know, if you're a writer, director, filmmaker, you know, put your concentration on writing something that is gonna get you into that system, or directing a short that's gonna get you into that system, where the financing is coming from a studio. And that it's, you know, it's with that comes more restrictions. You know, you're dealing with many more layers of gatekeepers and things like that. But I've always loved that process. I mean, I started with Clive's company. I started in that system, in the studio system, and setting up projects at studios. And, you know, you're kind of really honing that screenplay to fit the budget if it's in the millions. You know, if you're doing a project that's in the millions and you're like, okay, the funny thing that I've found is that doing a project that is multi-millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars, it never feels different in the process of making the movie. You're always hit with the same constraints in a way. And you just adjust to it. It's weird how you think it would feel drastically different, but it doesn't to me. Now, the other ways, like with Scott, when we worked, the films we did in Florida, those were financed with private equity. So Scott put the man hours in to cultivate relationships with people not in the film business. You know, because there's a lot of people in the world that have money and they're in finance or business, and they, you know, making movies is sexy, or it's an adventure, or it's, you know, they'll have like, I'll come to set and I'll be part of this process, and also a lot of people don't need to make their money back. You know, it's not, a lot of financing is a write-off to their other business. So film, you know, makes sense to them. They can put a lot of equity in something and they don't need a payout right away. It's something that builds over time. And so that's one way to do it. You know, and now with things like Kickstarter and, you know, Indiegogo, you know, people are self-financing with crowdfunding, which is something that I have not done personally, but know a lot of people that have. There's a lot of ways to fund a picture right now. And I've kind of been part of most of them. I think one of the most pragmatic ways is you're dissecting the movie and its components. You're bringing in relationship financiers that are selling overseas, right? They're going to the film markets like AFM and Berlin, and they're taking your poster and they're taking your concept and they're pre-selling markets, or they're raising it based on an actor you may have in the film, and they're saying, okay, we can give you $500,000 to go shoot this movie. So there's just so many different ways you can fund a movie now that there is no one way, really.
What are your thoughts on putting your own money into your movies?
I think if you're doing a short, then yes. Like I think, you know, if you can raise money yourself, you can use your own equity, you can have family give you funds, then for sure, because that's an investment in your career. You should try to get as much as you can to make that best short as possible, because that's going to be your calling card, and it can launch your whole career. So I think that's, if you're doing a feature, I would never recommend it. Like I don't think making an independent feature is going to return your investment. You know, I think that's a dangerous thing to do. because unless you're winning Sundance, there's not a lot of people that get big opportunities from making features. Like something you learn when you go to Cannes is that you walk through that marketplace and you realize, okay, there are thousands of movies being made every year that never see the light of day. And here they are at this marketplace. I always thought that was really fascinating. That it was like, okay, and it makes you also kind of reinforces what you're doing in a sense that like, okay, you're making movies that are getting seen by audiences and getting good distribution thing. That's hard, for like never anyone who gets their movie out there, like never disparage that, like, oh, I wish more people saw it. Like if you get distribution, you've won a huge part of that because so many movies don't. So I would never say, put your own money into a feature.
You say that someone who gets distribution, they're already sort of miles ahead. But what if that movie doesn't make a penny back? What if they see nothing from their distributor? Should they still say, hey, look, I've accomplished something?
Well, yeah, because it's a stepping stone to their career. I think in indie filmmaking, the movie making money is going to be a long road, for the most part. So I don't think anyone should get disparaged by. Also, distributors are always going to be a bit cagey about how much the movie's really making, and when you see the reporting, and it's not cut and dry, and it's very technical, and I think most people don't expect their movies to make money right away. So if someone's distributing your movie, they have a 5-year plan. They have a 5 to 15-year plan. They know that this is going to make this much money by year 9 or 10, and that's part of their business. So I don't think people should ever get caught up on the money and how much money it makes. You should get caught up on, does it open doors for you? Are the right people seeing it at festivals? Can you get into the right people's hands? Because you're always going to have to take control of that to some extent, and not just expect people to like knock on your door. Like, hey, you want to make a movie? You've just made this movie, you want to make another?
Will you begin filming before you have your entire budget in place?
I've never done that, but I know filmmakers that have, and they film when they can. They may be shooting only on the weekends, or they'll shoot as much. And you can do it. You can put a reel together. All right, if you're shooting, you put a reel together and try to get more financing. So if you're really confident about your idea and about your vision for it, then it's a way to do it. If you can get a teaser together and then bring that to financiers or distributors, you could raise the other funds or getting other talent involved. It's a good way to do it.
Have you been to many film markets? You said you walked through Cannes and you saw all these titles.
I mean, especially when I was with Clive, we'd go to the film markets a lot and we'd see the movies there. We'd watch the new, because we were always looking for writers and directors to adapt Clive's stuff, and so we could set up his projects. So we would go to the markets a lot and watch movies. And with a film, I don't usually go with a film. Like the film may go, I don't often travel with it, but sometimes we will, just to kind of be a part of it, or if we're having a screening there and we can afford to send us all, we'll go.
What's the best lesson you can teach us about movie financing?
I think it changes on a yearly basis. And I think if you're a filmmaker that wants to get a feature made, and I think it's always going to be challenging to raise that equity yourself. I think right now is a good time to really hone your concept. Make sure you have a concept that not only is personal to you, but is something that other people are going to want to get excited about. So you're bringing something fresh and new. And I feel right now is a time to make shorts. That's my opinion. That's what I'm seeing in the market. There's a lot of short content going around again. It was like that in the mid-2000s. I feel like it's like that again. A lot of filmmakers are getting opportunities based on their shorts, their short stories even, not even short films, but short stories. So if you can put a chunk of change in a short and make it look like a feature, you make it look as sophisticated as you can, and also make sure it's a proof of concept that someone can be like, I could turn this into a movie. I can't say that enough, that if you're making a short just because you think it's a cute short or a good story, but if you just want to make short films and that's your thing, then by all means. But if you want to be shooting features and you're going to spend all that effort and money and time on a short, make sure it's a proof of concept for a larger idea. Something that someone can be like, oh, this would make a great film. This is a great idea. I can see this has legs for a feature. I think that's really the way to do it, because then the financing will find you.
What about financing in a down economy? You talked about, mid 2000s. Okay, well, 2005 versus 2008 is going to have a lot different opportunity. Not sure where we are in the economy currently, but it seems like it might be tougher.
I think it's on the sizes too. I think if you're, when Scott was raising money and he's doing it in a state, he was doing it in Florida where, he had made contacts with people that were wealthy. I think at one end, a down economy only hurts certain classes. People who have money are still going to have money. They're not affected by the economy in the same way others are. And movies are always been known to be resilient in recession. So I think it's approaching it the same way. But if you're making a short, you have a lot of options at your disposal to raise funds if you're doing a crowdfunding or something like that. Because you can make a short, you can make a good short for $1,000. I mean, you can make a great short for $30,000. So in that realm, if you can raise $1,000 to make a short, just make sure you're telling the right short for $30,000. I just watched a short the other day that was very contained, almost no lighting, but it was a great concept, and I could see that, oh, this would make a great movie. So it was 2 rooms, but it was enough to, and it also got picked up by a studio. So it works if you can find the right idea. You don't need a ton of financing to do it.
If you had to teach a class on the business of making movies, where would you start?
I would start with idea. I think idea is where it begins. And I talk about, it's like an efficiency of, it can't all be an art. It's a business. Like filmmaking is a business as well. I think I've learned that from my producing side of things. You have to be able to collaborate with others to find that medium between art and commerce. And I think your idea doesn't have to be something grand that's going to change the world. It needs to be very personal to you as a filmmaker as well. So you might either have a great idea or you could have a great story within you, and you can tell that as well. But I think that's really where it has to start. You have to ask yourself, well, why am I doing this? Why am I doing it? Because it's a hard business too. So you have to have the dexterity and the stamina to withstand it for so many years. So you have to ask yourself those questions. But yeah, I would always start with the idea. I think you have to really nail it down, and you have to get a screenplay written, and you approach it that way.
How do you stay smart about the business choices you make?
I think I'm one to say that entertainment is a lot of its luck, a big part of its luck. I mean, you have to do your best work, but you cannot, there's so many factors involved in making and releasing a movie, as well as the timing of that release, not only day to day, but year to year, that you can't control it all, and you can't get caught up on it. So You just have to do what inspires you and stick to your guns on that, and try not to worry about too much of the rest of it. You know, and that's different for every filmmaker who's at a different stage in their career, but you're always going to have a hard time controlling every aspect. So I think you have to kind of let it go in some ways when you're working. It's a collaboration with so many different people that you know, something could happen in the world that could completely derail the release of your movie, and you just can't control that.
Sure.
It's just part of the process.
Especially nowadays too. Yeah, we've heard about that from filmmakers. Did you know that you were a quote unquote lifer when you flew out here from for lack of a better term, like I'm sticking with this no matter what?
Yeah, I think I was. I mean, I knew I wanted to get into film at a very young age, and once I made films in high school and stuff like that. But once I got to college, for me it was all dedication to college. I was commuting to college. I was not going to parties. I was very focused on college and film. And then I went to Emerson in Boston, and I went to Emerson because they had an LA program. I was like, well, I can then take my last semester in Los Angeles and then just stay. And that's what I did. I came out to LA that last semester, and I just moved at the time, and that was it. I was like, okay, I'm in it now. And I was lucky enough to get a job with Clive before I graduated. So, yeah, I'm a lifer.
When it comes to being a filmmaker, what would you tell a new filmmaker who wants to be the next Woody Allen or Wes Anderson?
I think it's the same thing, at least right now, and people watching this now. I think it's about honing a really good short, and in that genre, in those styles, because it's your calling card. You know, if you're just starting out, right, you're going to enter the festivals, and you're going to enter the competitions. I think those are beneficial. You'll meet people doing that. You'll open doors for yourself. And if you do that, if you make a film that isn't connecting with people, then ask yourself, why isn't it? And make another one. And you'll do that until you find one that hits and that connects with the gatekeepers in the industry, and it will get you those connections that you need. But I always think it's better, you know, if you don't want to be a filmmaker, if you want to be a writer, it's the same thing. You write, you know, if you want to be a cinematographer, you shoot. You have to do it, and you have to get it in front of the people that are going to help your career at any stage. So, and there's a lot at your disposal now in terms of festivals and competitions and things like the Blacklist even, that you can now work with them to hone a script to get it on their list. I think that all these things, there's so much more now than there was years ago. So you just got to keep trying and making content and making sure it's at a standard that people would want to give you an opportunity. You know, if you're, and not all filmmakers are going to have that eye, that standard of how is this better than this? But the ones that do have that eye, you know, if you're making movies that aren't connecting with people at festivals or and festivals are tricky because they have a plan. Festivals have an agenda, you know, and not an agenda in a negative way. They have a vision for what that year is going to be. And your movie may not fit in that vision. It doesn't mean it's not a great movie. So get it in front of competitions and things like that too. That can give you a sense. Because look at who those judges are. You look down the line like, oh, who's going to be watching and judging your film? See who those people are. And if those are the people that can give you opportunities, if they like what they see, that's important. And don't waste your money entering something if the people on that list aren't people that can help you as a filmmaker.
Sure, and there's some wonderful short film festivals.
Yeah.
But at some point, though, is it time to sort of, you know, get off the pot, for lack of a better term, and make a feature?
Yeah, I mean, see, it's tricky for me because I started as a feature filmmaker. I guess it's all about what your goals are. as a filmmaker. If you can raise the money to make a feature and you really have a feature that you want to tell, then yeah, why not? You know, if you can do it. But I guess if you're making a lot of shorts and that's not clicking for you, then yes, make a feature. I think you always got to try, as my wife says over and over, like, if the door's not opening for you, then go crawl in the window. You know, there's always a way to get in. So I think you just got to keep trying. If you're that passionate about it, then you got to keep trying and keep creating. So yeah, I think if you're making shorts and they're not getting you what you want, then make a feature if you can get the money together to do it.
Do you really think that there are no gatekeepers, that the democratization of film it's in our hands? I mean, that was something that was said a lot in the maybe 2010-ish era, but now do you think we've kind of come back to the fact that there are gatekeepers?
I think there's gatekeepers for sure, but they're not in a bad sense. Gatekeepers are people that work in the business, you know, that are going to give you opportunities, and they're all ages. You know, I'm you know, taking meetings with 20-year-olds, you know, because that's the nature of the business. So there's always going to be executives are always going to get younger and younger, you know, and you're meeting all kinds of people, and they're all gatekeepers in some extent. And I don't use that as a bad word. I think that's every gatekeeper that you meet is an opportunity, you know, that could really because that's their whole job is to find you. You know, that's their entire business, is to find new filmmakers and cultivate that talent. That's exactly what they're there to do.
Yeah, I'm not sure which actor this was. I think it was a Mark Maron episode where the actor wasn't able to get any projects off the ground, but then when younger executives or junior executives, whatever, came in, they remembered him from other shows,
Yeah.
and they wanted him. But he, in his own sort of wheelhouse and generation,
Yeah.
he was seen as not viable.
Yeah.
So sometimes that's helpful too.
For sure. You're always getting fresh blood coming in. And it is kind of funny. It's like people who are like, oh, I saw you in this like years ago. I love you. And you get a whole new fan base.
If it weren't for horror filmmaking specifically, how would you be able to support yourself?
I mean, I think it's good to develop crafts. You know, I mean, I think editing is a craft. So I think that it's all entertainment adjacent, right? You know, as a filmmaker, I have years of experience now in film. You know, you can pass that on to other people. So there's that, and there's editing. And horror for me, I started as a writer, and before I was directing, I was writing. And most of the stuff I write is not horror. I don't write horror all the time. I'm doing a lot of different genres. And it's funny because there's so much behind the scenes in entertainment. You know, I'll work on screenplays that just never get made, but you're still creating income from that. So that's a big part of it, you know, the behind the scenes that, you know, may not be on your IMDb. There's a lot of that. And I know some filmmakers put so much stuff like they have in development, but I don't tend to do that. I feel like I'm more secretive about the stuff I work on. I don't like, if I have a screenplay, I don't put it up there and be like, oh, here's my next screenplay. Because I've always been like, oh, I don't want to start talking about it until it's real, you know, that kind of way. But that's a lot of it. So if like, as a director, I may direct on, you know, now especially once every 3 or 4 or 5 years, but in between that, I'm writing a lot.
Do you think it almost jinxes it when people, you know, put out, hey, big news coming? Is it better to just have the news?
I mean, I think so. I'm that way. I mean, maybe that's superstitious, but I feel like, well, just let it be real and then talk about it. You know, once you're at the stage where you're going to announce something, great, sure, do that. And it could still fall apart, you know, but those announcements help your career. You know, that's an important part of it, is getting those announcements when you can, and trying to force those announcements when you have those opportunities is a good idea as well. But take it, that's just my theory about it. I don't like to advertise stuff until I know it's like legit and happening.
Do you think it helps to take breaks for a little bit, or should it always be nose to the grindstone?
I'm very much nose to the grindstone. I don't take a lot of breaks I'll take like, after I finish a movie, like once it's wrapped in the can, before it comes out, I'll take like a 2-week break or something and then just start working on a new concept. But breaks are good. When you're writing, I think taking breaks helps the process. Taking naps, watching movies, I think that's all part of the process. So I feel like I think you have to make sure you're dedicated to it. But of course, everyone have other jobs, and not everyone's working in film full time, and that's all part of it too. You have to, that's the break from the filmmaking process, right? You're spending time at another job and stuff. So I think that's part of it. You have to clear your head and make sure that if you're pursuing something, you have to make sure you have a goal that you reach.
What's your reaction to this comment, Anthony? There isn't anything new out there, just different actors with the same ideas, especially in the Hollywood industry.
I think to some extent that's true, and it doesn't have to be seen as a negative. And as I've been in this business 20 years now. I was just talking to someone the other day about it. I talk to my wife about it all the time. That we're always telling the same stories, but you're telling them to new generations. And I think that's something that we forget. That, when they made Happy Death Day, I was like, why would they make that movie? Groundhog's Day was already made. I was very much in that, because I love Groundhog's Day. and I'm like, why are they making Happy Death Day? And then I went to see Happy Death Day with my wife, and she loved it. And I'm like, this is a great movie. It's a great movie. And Blumhouse does that a lot, kind of taking like Freaky Friday and like taking these ideas and doing them. And I think you kind of have to go with the flow and say, you know what? That's actually a good thing, because we have to remember that every day someone is being born, thousands of people are being born, and they do not have time or care to go back and watch anything that came out, 10 years before they were born. So it's important, I think, to revisit old stuff. And once they see something, they're like, like this movie, they'll go and maybe hopefully check out the original or something like that. On the flip side, and Scorsese's talking a lot about this, kind of this death of cinema, I do agree that I think movie business has become very corporatized, and it's slowly dying in a way, not slowly, maybe quickly, and that you'd want studios to cultivate those movies that aren't just there to get people in seats. I think A24 does that. I think there are studios that do that for sure. But obviously, like Scorsese talks about that a lot, and he must have a fear of this like death of, he's not a fear so much as he's been very clear about it. He's done all he can. It's up to these younger generations to make sure they're making the next Goodfellas or Taxi Driver. And that there's resources for filmmakers to tell those stories. Almost, if we could find a way that studios would get tax incentives for telling those stories, that would be the best case scenario. If it was lumped into their corporate structure that they spend $100 million a year on, 6 movies that are of a certain kind of storytelling, that would be great, because it would give them reasons to do that and not just think about the bottom line and things like that.
But not everybody wants to see an art house film.
No.
Some people want to see something with a very happy resolution, and then they're just going to go home and forget about it.
Well, and I think that's what's important, is that the movie doesn't have to make money. You know what I mean? That it's worth telling a piece of art with enough money to tell it right, where the movie doesn't have to recoup right away in a box office weekend, because the movie's around forever. They're going to make that. They're going to make money off that movie forever, as long as it's not forgotten in something. They're going to generate revenue for years and years and years. So why does it all have to happen in one weekend? I mean, when I was growing up, right, and when you guys were growing up, a movie would hit the theaters and it would be out for a year. Like it would, even up to the era of Titanic. How long was Titanic in theaters? Like 14 months or something? They don't do that anymore.
No, there's a very short window for any kind of promotion or, and you'll see a trailer and you'll go, wait, what happened with that? I wanted to see that.
Yeah, and it's gone.
And then it's gone.
It's on iTunes. Like, you're like, oh, wait.
Right, I missed that.
Already. Yeah.
Yeah. Is filmmaking as competitive today as it was 10 years ago?
I think more so, for sure. I think it keeps getting more competitive because it's becoming easier and easier in a consumer market to make movies. And it's now become global, It's kind of like a good example with actors is, post-pandemic, their competition has now become global because they're just taping on Zoom and they're sending in tapes. Very few times are they going into a room and meeting people anymore. So there's like the landscape is becoming bigger and bigger and the films are becoming more and more. So the content, I can't keep up with the content, I don't know half the time what show I'm watching, meaning like I think always like talking to my wife, I'm like, what are the shows we watch? Remind me what we watch what do I like to watch? Because there's just so much that you kind of forget. So it's so competitive now. It's so competitive. On the flip side, there's more work because there is so much, but to me, it feels more competitive.
Do you think the world's more competitive?
Yeah, I mean, number one, we're still in a generation of filmmakers. I'm still making movies with Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg, right? They are still making movies, and they were making movies when I was an infant. So there's this whole kind of global sense that we're in this single generation of storytelling now, and it's worldwide, and it's weird when you think about it like that because you wonder, like, well, what is film gonna be in 100 years? Maybe it's only alive, right, for a very short window of human history, and then it becomes something else because it has changed so much so rapidly in the 20 years I've been doing it.
Sure. But then there's also generations that like things that are considered retro.
Yes.
So who knows, it'll become maybe a hologram for a while and then it'll go back to the old classics of the 2000s.
Yeah.
So
people will be shooting on 16 millimeter again.
Sure. How much harder is it to stand out now as a filmmaker than it was a decade ago?
I think I guess it's hard to say as a new filmmaker. I can only say from my point of view, at least for me, I don't think it's gotten harder for me because like you're carrying your library with you, like with every movie you make, you're getting new viewership. So you're cultivating a fan base in some way or people that know your work, and also in the town, people that know your work. So I don't think it's felt harder for me, at least. It feels like the momentum's there. I think I can't put my shoes in a new filmmaker, but I imagine it's daunting having to, kind of what I said, competing with, I'm still making movies in the era of Steven Spielberg, right? The person that, if someone, if Scorsese inspired you, but he's still making movies, you're still in the same boat with so many filmmakers in the same generation that it has to be daunting in some ways.
Would you have gone the same route? Let's suppose you were 19 and you were entertaining college or already in college. Would you have taken the same route? Or do you think that some of that is no longer?
Yeah, I would have gone the same route. I mean, I have to be grateful with all the opportunities I've had. And there's, you're always gonna, I think that's what's great about this business is that I don't at least ever get tired of the chase in a way. I mean, you have to know that this business is a roller coaster. You're gonna have feast and famine. And you can look at any career in this business. You could have an actor that is in the hit show for 5 years straight and then not have a career 3 years later. That is the business we're in. So it's not for everybody. You have to have a real passion for it. And you have to you're always going to have moments where you're jaded by it, but you have to really find ways to fight through that and get reinvigorated again. And also being, loving isolation, I think, in the sense that I find great pleasure in finishing a screenplay, right? I get a lot of self-worth from that. Nobody has to read it because I feel accomplished. And if you're the kind of person that can feel like that's a win, if you finish something, regardless of what happens to it next, you make a short film or you write a story or create a piece of artwork or photograph something and get that sense of confidence and self-worth from that, then you're probably cut out for the business, for this entertainment business, because it's not for everybody.
I love that terminology, the chase.
Yeah.
That's very much what it is.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a chase. And it's going to be a chase till the day you die, probably. For most people. I mean, for most people in the business, is there's only so many people that reach that status of, our Christopher Nolans and our Steven Spielbergs, and it's a very small number.
Sure, but then there's new problems, I'm sure. Not
Yeah.
that I've
Yeah,
ever had them.
exactly.
But that people are then talking about either comparing your successes,
Yeah.
and it's happening in an instant now.
Yeah.
All over the world. So yeah, I'm sure that's not easy to
Well,
do.
I think when people reach a certain status in their career, there's immense pressure to hold on to it. And that almost is probably worse than other kinds of chasing, right? Is I'm at the top, how do I stay here? But that's because it's a roller coaster. You're never going to stay at the top. You're always going to hit the bottom eventually. You just got to go up again.
Sure, and doing it with grace.
Yeah.
And that's probably the tough part. And when there's a microscope on you.
Yeah.
So, man. What are your top 5 Halloween movies? Must see every Halloween.
Oh, okay. For me, again, listen, I have what I make and what I watch are two different things. But the movies I always watch around Halloween are Fright Night, Hocus Pocus, Lost Boys, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, and, let's say maybe Halloween 3 I really enjoy. It's a very spirited Halloween movie. Is that 5?
I think so, yeah. I like those. Are you dressing up while you're watching them or no?
I mean, I used to dress up a lot, and it's funny because I feel like I live like Halloween all year round, that I do less and less. I decorate less and I dress up less than I used to because I'm living it all the time. This Halloween, though, I have specifically been craving the classics, and I picked up all the Universal Monster movies on 4K. And I haven't seen them on 4K yet, so I'm going to make my wife watch all those.
What are your top 5 hidden gems of Halloween films, that obscure movies maybe no one's heard of, maybe only diehard horror people would know?
Well, I love Dark Night of the Scarecrow is definitely one. A horror movie that was made for TV years ago in the late 70s, and it's really good. It's a really good kind of classic, creepy story. I like The Sentinel, which is a very Polanski-esque, almost, it has feels of Rosemary's Baby, but I don't think a lot of people hunt out The Sentinel. I like Phenomena, which is Night of the Creeps, which is one of the first movies I watched as a kid. With Jennifer Connelly's in that, Donald Pleasance. I like Fright Night 2, which a lot of people ignore. I think it's just as good as the first one, if you're into that. And a guilty pleasure of mine is Bad Moon, which is a werewolf movie about a white werewolf. And it has Michael Pare in it, who I really like. Also, if you've never seen Eddie and the Cruisers, which is not a horror movie, but it's a Michael Pare movie I really like.
What was the last movie you saw that really scared you?
That's tough. That's tough. Because I watch horror in a different way. I mean, I think I watch horror as like an educational process. I've never been scared very much by horror. When I was a kid, obviously when I was a kid, watching Nightmare on Elm Street at like 8 scared me. And watching The Shining at a young age, scared me. Now it's kind of like essences of, ooh, that creeped me out. Ooh, that gave me chills. I think Smile had some nice moments in it that got the slower parts in that movie. It's that creeping, these, little things. I like ghost stories a lot. Movies that deal with an entity in the dark and things like that. I think Hereditary is creepy. I think it's got a lot of, it also has such good performances, and I think that's what gets behind it. That movie's disturbing in a way that made me not want to watch it again. But I have, I've revisited it since for the performances and stuff. But when I first saw it, I was like, man, that's a dark movie. But it's been a while since I've seen it. But Smile wasn't that long ago, but that had some beats in it that creeped me out.